If you've ever glanced at a map of Southeast Asia, you might have noticed a small landlocked country squeezed between Thailand and Vietnam. That's Laos, quiet, underrated, and often overlooked. But not for much longer. Because today we're diving deep into everything you need to know. From its ancient history to its modern-day culture. So don't go anywhere. The story begins with the Lao people, who originally came from Yunnan in China. They were pushed south in the 13th century, eventually settling near the Khmer Empire. And that's when a young prince named Phan Gum enters the picture. Born into royalty, exiled as a baby, and raised in the heart of the Khmer Empire, he returned years later with an army and a mission to unite the region under one kingdom. He succeeded, and in 1353 the kingdom of Lan Xang was born, which means land of a million elephants. Along with the soldiers, Phan Gum brought religion too, and with the help of his Khmer in-laws, he introduced Theravada Buddhism, along with sacred scriptures and a golden Buddha statue called Prabang. That statue became such a symbol of Lao kingship that they even renamed the capital after it, Luang Prabang. For a while things flourished. Lan Xang held its own, gaining territory and prestige. But in 1694, everything fell apart. Civil wars broke out, and the once great kingdom splintered into three: Luang Prabang in the north, Vientiane in the middle, and Champasak in the south. The infighting didn't help, and neither did the neighbours, especially Siam, who took control of most of Laos by the late 18th century. Eventually, the region was folded into French Indochina. The French called it Laos, a colonial name that lumped together three separate Lao kingdoms. But here's an interesting side note. Most Lao people didn't actually live there. They were, and surprisingly still are, just across the river in what's now northeastern Thailand. In fact, more Lao live in Thailand today than in Laos itself. Alright, now going back. Under French rule, Laos didn't exactly thrive. There were no universities, barely any roads, and not much investment beyond a little opium trade. The French brought in Vietnamese administrators and left the Lao population largely untouched, or in other words, underdeveloped. After World War II, Laos briefly declared independence, but the French came back. And in 1953, they finally granted independence to a constitutional monarchy, but the power vacuum was quickly filled with tension. One side had US backing, the other had North Vietnam and the Soviet Union. That tug of war turned into civil war, and Laos, despite declaring itself neutral, became a battleground. So, while most of the world focused on Vietnam, Laos was getting bombed into the record books. Literally, it holds the grim title of the most heavily bombed country in history. During the so-called Secret War, the US dropped over 2 million tons of bombs, more than what was dropped on Germany and Japan combined in World War II, but not a lot of people know that. Then, after the fall of Saigon in 1975, the communist Pathet Lao swept into power. The monarchy was abolished, and Buddhism was stripped from the state. Thus, the Lao People's Democratic Republic was born, and it's still the only political party allowed to govern today. But as you can imagine, the early years under communism were harsh. There were food shortages, thousands of refugees fled across the Mekong, and life was tightly controlled. But in the 1990s, reforms started trickling in. The government brought back Buddhism, and this time as a way to foster national identity. They opened up the economy, reconnected with Thailand, and later joined ASEAN and the WTO. Even President Obama stopped by in 2016, marking the first ever visit by a sitting US president. Moving on to geography, Laos might not have any beaches, but that doesn't mean it's lacking in natural drama. This is the only landlocked country in Southeast Asia, and about 3/4 of it is covered in steep mountains and thick forest. So it goes without saying, getting around isn't exactly easy. Roads twist and wind through the highlands, and a lot of the terrain is just too rugged to live on. So you might be wondering, how do people get around? That's where the Mekong River comes in. It flows more than 1,835 kilometres, or about 1,140 miles, through Laos, running from China all the way down to Vietnam. The Mekong's a transport route, a fishing ground, and a power source. Plus, it floods every year, leaving behind nutrient-rich soil that helps grow enough rice to feed the entire country. No surprise, then, that most people live along the river, where the land is flatter and farming is possible. These lowland areas make up just a quarter of the country, but they're crucial. You've got places like the Vientiane Plain and the Bolovens Plateau, where the soil is so fertile. So locals can grow everything from rice and tea to strawberries and pineapples. Between the river and the mountains are three key plateaus: Shanghuang, Khammouan, and Bolovens. The Shanghuang Plateau is the biggest, but the Bolovens, down near Cambodia, is the most agriculturally rich. So coffee lovers, take note. This is where some of the region's best beans are grown. Now, if you go north, things get really wild. Mountain ranges dominate the landscape, especially in places like Shanghuang province. The highest peak in Laos is Phu Bia, which stands tall at 2,817 metres or 9,242 feet. And while that's the highest point, countless other peaks average around 1,500 metres or roughly 4,900 feet above sea level. Besides the impressive landscape, another thing you need to keep in mind is the climate. Laos has that classic tropical monsoon feel, which means hot, humid, and with clear wet and dry seasons. The rainy season typically runs from May to October, with some areas like the Bolovens Plateau getting drenched with rain. The dry season goes from November to April, and just before the rains hit in March and April, temperatures can soar past 32 degrees Celsius, or about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's not hot everywhere. In the mountains, it can actually get pretty chilly. In fact, between December and February, temperatures can drop to around 15 degrees Celsius, or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And in places like the Plain of Jars, it can even get close to freezing during winter. And through all these, it's only natural that Laos should be teeming with life. There are tropical rainforests up north, monsoon forests in the south, and an incredible mix of wildlife, with nearly 200 species of mammals, hundreds of reptiles and amphibians, and over 700 kinds of birds. You've also got everything from bears and monkeys to endangered elephants and gibbons. And in the skies, you might spot some hornbills, ibises and storks. Unfortunately, many of them are rare or at risk. Okay, so now, let's go back down and explore Laos's political and economic landscape. So, Laos has spent decades trying to reshape its economy from a tightly controlled system to something more open and market-driven. As of 2024, the country's GDP stands at about $16.5 billion. Since the mid-80s, the government's removed fixed prices, introduced Western-style banking, and even encouraged private businesses. It's joined ASEAN, the WTO, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a huge trade bloc, so it's clear to see that the intention to open up is there, but on the ground, things are a lot more complicated. Laos's economy is heavily dependent on exporting raw materials like hydropower, timber, minerals, and a bit of agriculture. The problem is, not much value is being added within the country. Most things are sold as is, and that means fewer jobs, slower development, and very little resilience when the global economy shakes. And shake it did, because even before COVID, Laos's growth was already slowing down from 8% in 2013 to 5.5% in 2019. Then the pandemic hit. That's when tourism collapsed, inflation soared, and the currency tanked. In 2022, inflation peaked at a staggering 37%, the highest in the region. By 2025, it's expected to fall to around 11%, but prices are still rising faster than people's incomes. On top of this, Laos has a serious debt problem. The country's public debt is at 116% of its GDP, which is unsustainable by any standard. Debt repayments are so steep that Laos had to defer some of them, mainly to China. But even with those deferrals, payments could hit $1.3 billion a year from 2025 onward. Because of that, China now owns key national infrastructure, including the country's power grid and the high-speed railway to Vientiane. It's sparked real concerns about just how much leverage Beijing now holds. Meanwhile, regular Lao families are feeling the crunch. Real wages are falling, jobs are hard to come by, and more people are turning to informal work or migrating abroad, especially to Thailand. 1/3 of households have had to cut back on food, healthcare and schooling, which is a long-term struggle that directly impacts the next generation. And right now, a child born in Laos is expected to reach only half of their potential productivity due to poor access to health and education. In rural areas where most people live, small farms are giving way to large-scale industrial plantations. And as a result, agriculture's share of the GDP has dropped from 46% in 1990 to just 16% today. Services and industry are rising, but the labour market isn't keeping up. Businesses say they can't find enough skilled workers, and many investors are hesitant, pointing to poor transparency and limited competition. Politically, not a whole lot has changed. Laos is still run by the Lao People's Revolutionary Party. In 2022, Prime Minister Phankham Viphavan stepped down after facing a wave of criticism, and his replacement was Sonexay Sifandone, aka a member of a powerful revolutionary family. This means the political structure is staying firmly intact, even though the government says it wants reform. Though there have been a few steps in that direction, progress has been slow. Especially with the country facing multiple crises, leaders have doubled down on natural resource extraction just to keep the economy going. That might work for now, but it brings up serious questions about sustainability, biodiversity, and what kind of environmental future Laos is heading toward. That said, there is real potential here. Laos has rich mineral deposits, huge hydropower capacity, and a very young population with over a third of the people under 15 years of age. Additionally, ecotourism could also be a game changer, especially with more travellers looking for off-the-radar destinations. But unlocking that potential, that's going to depend on whether Laos can manage its debt and invest in its people. And speaking of people, Laotians are known for their peaceful nature, warm smiles, and deep respect for tradition. Which brings us to our next topic, culture. This small Southeast Asian country is home to over 68 ethnic groups. The majority are Lao Lum, or lowland Lao, who live along the Mekong River. Then there are the Lao Theung, upland dwellers often marginalised in the past. And in the remote highlands, you'll find the Lao Sung, including the Hmong and Yao, who migrated centuries ago from China. Laos is officially a Buddhist country, with golden stupas like Pathat Luang symbolising national identity. But beneath that surface lies a strong current of animist beliefs, including the deeply spiritual Baisi ceremony, which is a ritual to call back guardian spirits during big life events like weddings, births, or even just a homecoming. And you'll see this spiritual mix and tradition reflected in everyday life. Take traditional clothing, for example. Lao women often wear the Fa Sin, a beautifully patterned silk skirt, especially during ceremonies or when working in government offices. Men, on the other hand, usually stick to Western clothing, but for special events, they'll drape on a Fa Biang, a ceremonial sash worn across the shoulder. Then there's the architecture. Houses are often built on stilts to allow airflow underneath, which is an incredibly clever way to beat the heat. And when it comes to stairs, many are built with odd numbers because it's considered lucky in Lao belief. In the countryside, tradition feels even more alive. Farming still shapes the rhythm of daily life. Men plough the fields, women transplant the rice. And when the work is done, both head into the forest to gather wild herbs, bamboo, resins, or even hunt game. And they don't really do it for profit. They mainly do it as a form of survival. But if you think you've seen Lao culture in all its might, wait until you check out its arts. I'm talking about intricate weaving and silverwork to the sounds of the kini, a bamboo mouth organ that turns up at every celebration. Age-old stories like Sinzay, Hindu epics and Buddhist teachings inspire vibrant dance dramas, while local vocal duels like Lam and Kap add humour and heart to village gatherings. Even court music, which nearly vanished after 1975, is slowly making a comeback. It's kept alive in royal museums and taught by exiled masters to a new generation. So here's a question for you. If you had 24 hours in Laos, would you spend them exploring ancient temples, hiking mountain trails, eating with the locals, or admiring traditional art? Drop your answers in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this one, you're going to love this next one.